In the deep stillness before dawn, when the world lies suspended, between darkness and the first pale breath of morning, there existed a life so common that history rarely bothered to record it, yet so essential that the great estates of the empire could not have survived a single season without it. For long before the sun touched the tiled roofs of the wealthy, and long before the markets stirred with voices and trade, there were those who rose in silence, whose footsteps shaped the soil, whose hands fed the households, whose bodies carried the weight of a world that did not speak their names. Across the vast lands of the Roman countryside, the enslaved lived in many forms. Some bound to the fields where the earth clung to their feet, and the seasons carved themselves into their skin. Others kept within the walls of the villa, where they tended fires, prepared meals, mended garments, and carried water through long corridors of stone. And still others labored in workshops, where iron rang against anvils, or in storehouses, where grain was measured and stored. And each life was shaped by the demands of the estate that owned them, their days unfolding not by choice, but by command. Some were born into bondage, never knowing another world, their first breaths taken in storerooms or cramped quarters where the air smelled of straw and smoke, while others had once been free, taken in war or sold by debt or misfortune, their memories carrying the faint ache of a life that had slipped beyond reach. And though their origins differed, their futures were bound by the same unyielding structure, a hierarchy that placed them beneath the authority of overseers, whose voices marked the rhythm of their days. Diet that sustained them was simple and spare, coarse bread made from barley or wheat, thin porridge boiled in large clay pots, olives when the season allowed, a handful of beans or lentils, and on rare occasions a scrap of meat or cheese. And though the food was plain, it was measured carefully, for the estate needed bodies strong enough to work, yet not so well fed that they might grow bold. And hunger was a quiet companion that followed many through the turning of the year life. Expectancy for those in the fields was often short, the constant labor wearing down the body long before age could claim it, the heat of summer burning the skin, the cold of winter stiffening the joints, the tools heavy in the hands, the baskets cutting into the shoulders, and sickness moved easily through the quarters where many slept close together, fevers rising in the night, coughs lingering through the cold months, wounds healing slowly beneath rough cloth. And yet, despite the hardships, there were moments of laughter, moments of rest beneath the shade of an olive tree, moments when a shared meal or a whispered story softened the weight of the day. Others lived longer within the villa walls, where the work was constant but less brutal, their tasks shaped by the needs of the household, tending lamps, sweeping floors, preparing meals, caring for children. And though their bodies endured fewer injuries, their lives were watched more closely, their movements measured by the expectations of those who owned them, and the quiet pressure of obedience rested on their shoulders like an invisible yoke. And beyond these were those whose skills set them apart, the scribes who kept accounts, the artisans who shaped pottery or metal, the healers who tended the sick. And though their knowledge granted them a different place within the estate, their freedom was no closer. For skill did not loosen the chains of ownership. It only changed the tasks assigned to the hands that bore them across all these lives. There ran a single thread, the unspoken truth that their days belonged to another, that their labor fed a world that rarely saw them, that their names were carried only in the memories of those who lived beside them. And yet, within this world of constraint, there existed a quiet resilience, a strength that rose not from power but from endurance, from the ability to continue through the turning of seasons, from the small acts of care shared in the dimness of the quarters, from the whispered stories passed from one generation to the next. And now, as the story you are about to hear begins to unfold, you may feel the ancient world draw close around you, the air thick with the scent of earth and smoke, the distant murmur of workers rising before dawn, the soft rustle of vines in the morning wind, and the quiet footsteps of those whose lives shaped the land even as the land shaped them. And as you listen, you may allow the weight of the present to loosen, the breath to slow, the thoughts to drift like dust in a warm beam of light. For the path ahead leads into a life lived in the shadows of an empire, a life carried forward, not by glory, but by the steady rhythm of survival beneath the turning sky. In the low, shadowed corner of a storeroom, where the stone walls drank the light and the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of damp straw, tallow, and the faint sourness of stored grain, a child was born into a world that measured life by labor and by the quiet economy of need. The mother drawing breath in short, controlled pulls as two older women moved with practiced hands to wrap the newborn in a strip of cloth that had already served for many births, its weave softened by repeated washing in cold water drawn from the estate well, its edges frayed and stained by years of use, and the lamp that burned in the center of the room threw a thin, wavering light that made the faces of those who tended the mother look like carved reliefs, their eyes deep with fatigue and with the small, private knowledge of how little time could be spared for anything that did not feed the household or mend the tools of work. Child's first cry was brief and quickly hushed against the mother's breast, for the overseer's footsteps could be heard in the courtyard even before the sun had fully risen. And the mother, who had already borne other children, and had seen some of them taken away by sale or taken by fever, pressed the infant close with a tenderness that was careful and guarded, as though affection itself might be taxed by the world around them. And she teed the child to her back with a strip of cloth, adjusting the knot with hands that had learned to move without complaint. For complaint was a luxury that invited attention and sometimes punishment, and the estate required hands more than it required voices. The storeroom was a place of small economies, where every scrap of cloth and every handful of grain was accounted for, and the child's first days were spent in the rhythm of these economies, carried on the mother's back as shared earn to the loom, the shuttle's steady motion marking the hours more surely than the sun. The women around her speaking in low tones about the tasks ahead, about the state of the vines on the slope, about the price of oil in the market town, and the child learned the cadence of work before learning the names of things, the creak of the loom and the soft thud of the shuttle, becoming the first measures of time that would shape a life other. Infants lay in baskets near the hearth, watched over by older children who were themselves scarcely more than children, their small hands clumsy as they tried to soothe the cries of those too young to understand feedments placed upon them. And the overseer would step into the room from tomato time, his sandals scraping the stone, his staff tapping the floor in our rhythm that made the workers' shoulders tighten, and the mothers would still their movements and lower their voices, for the overseer's displeasure could mean a harsher day, a withheld portion of bread, a reprimand that left a bruise in the spirit, if not on the skin as the child grew. The world opened in small, measured ways, the first unsteady steps taken across the packed earth of the courtyard, the first attempts to mimic the motions of the women at the loom, the first time the child was given a small task to carry a cup of water from the cistern to the hearth, to gather fallen twigs for the fire, to sweep the corner of the storeroom where dust gathered like a thin, persistent fog, and each task waistought with a seriousness that made play a rare thing. For every movement was practice for the labor that would one day be expected without complaint, and the child learned to move with a careful economy, to keep the eyes lowered when the overseer passed, to make the hands quick and sure so that mistakes would not be noticed. The estate itself was a landscape of work, a patchwork of vineyards on slopes, olive trees standing in scattered groves, fields of grain thatch rolled like pale seas in the wind, and the child watched the workers move through these spaces in long lines, their bodies bent beneath baskets of grapes or bundles of wood, their skin darkened by sun and wind, their clothing patched and mended, till the fabric itself told the story of seasons and of hands. And the child learned to read the world by these marks, understanding without words that some people moved with. The freedom of unburdened steps, while others moved with the steady, necessary rhythm of those who must always carry more than they could easily bear. Household above the storeroom was another world, where the Freeburn family lived in rooms with higher ceilings, and with windows that opened to thick courtyard, where the matron's voice could be heard giving orders, and where the children of the household played with toys carved from wood or with small balls of leather, their laughter bright and unguarded, and the child who had been born in the storeroom watched these scenes from a distance, learning the contours of a life that was not theirs, and feeling a small, sharp ache that had no name, a longing that was not spoken, because longing could be dangerous, for it might lead to questions that had no place in a life measured by the needs of others. The mother's life was a map of labor and of small resistances. She rose before dawn to tend the hearth and to prepare the coarse porridge that would be shared among the workers. She moved to the loom where her hands flew with the practiced motions of someone who had woven for years, her fingers calloused and sure, and in the evenings she mended garments by the light of the lamp, sewing patches with a needle that had been sharpened and used until the eye was smooth. And the child watched these motions and learned them as if they were a language, understanding that to be useful was to be safe, and that safety itself was a fragile thing that could be lost in a single day if the overseas step returned, or if the household's needs shifted with the market the father. If he was present, moved in a different register of labor, perhaps tending the animals in the early morning, his hands large and steady as led the goats to pasture or milked the ewes, his voice low as he spoke to the beasts, and the child watched him with a mixture of awe and distance. Fourth father's tasks often took him beyond the storeroom and into the fields where the air was wide and the sky seemed to stretch without boundary. And in those moments the child felt a faint, almost unbearable curiosity about the world beyond the courtyard, a curiosity that was tempered by the knowledge that the father's movements were not free in the way the child imagined, for he tunesward to the estate and to the overseer and to the demands of the household, and his steps, though they might cross the fields, were still measured by the needs of other siblings, when they existed, formed a small, complicated network of careened rivalry, older brothers and sisters taking on the role of guardians in the absence of adults, teaching the younger ones how to carry water without spilling, how to hold a basket so that it would not tip, how to move through the courtyard without drawing the overseer's notice. And the child learned from them not only the practical skills of survival, but also the quiet codes of the quarters, the ways of sharing a scrap of bread without being seen, the small signals that meant danger was near, the names of those who had been sold, and the places they had been taken, stories told in low voices about markets and ships, and the faces of strangers who had come to the estate to buy or to inspect the workers. And these stories were both a comfort and a wound, for they spoke of a world where people could be moved like goods, and where familia could be broken by a single transaction dreams, were a private thing, held close and rarely spoken aloud, for to speak of a life beyond the estate was to invite the overseer's suspicion. Yet the child watched the parents at night, and saw the way their faces softened when they slept, the way the mother's hand would rest on the child's head, as if to hold a memory in place, and the father, when he returned from the fields, would sometimes sit in the doorway and look toward the distant hills as though measuring the distance between what was and what might have been. And in those moments the child felt the presence of dreams like small, fragile birds that nested in the chest and fluttered when the wind of hope passed, though the birds were careful and rarely sang aloud. The quarters were a place of shared intimacies and of constant surveillance, where the walls were thin and the lives of many were pressed at each other like the layers of cloth in the storeroom. And the child learned the names of the other families who lived there. The woman who had lost 3 children to fever and who kept a small amulet tied to her wrist as if it might hold back the next sickness. The old man who had once been a skilled potter and who now mended broken tools with a patience that seemed to come from another age. The young woman who had been bought from a market town and who spoke of a sea she had seen once, a vastness that the child could not imagine, but that made the young woman's eyes shine with a memory that was both beautiful and painful. And these people became the child's world, their stories weaving into the child's own sense of belonging and of loss. Illness was a constant shadow, a presence that moved through the quarters with the seasons, and the child learned the signs of its approach, the way a cough would linger and deepen, the way a fever would make the skin hot and the breath quick, the way a child might grow listless and small, and the mothers would gather with herbs and with warm cloths, with poultices made from roots and from the bitter leaves of plants that grew near the well, and they would whisper prayers to gods whose names were spoken softly, for loud prayers might draw the overseer's attention, and sometimes the remedies worked and the child recovered, and sometimes they did not, and the body that had been so small and bright would grow still and be carried to a grave at the edge of the fields, marked by a stone or by a simple wooden stake, and the living would return to their tasks with a quiet that was not peace, but a necessary folding of grief into the fabric of daily life. Accidents happened with a frequency that made them ordinary. A child slipping on the wet stones near the cistern and breaking a bone, a hand caught in the loom shuttle, a fall from a low wall while chasing a stray hen. And the remedies were practical and often crude. Splints fashioned from wood, poultices of boiled herbs, the careful binding of a wound with strips of cloth. And the overseer's response to accidents was a measure of the household's need. For if the injured worker could be spared a few days, the overseer might allow it. But if the household's demands were pressing, the injured would be expected to return to labor sooner than their body might allow. And the child learned that the body was a tool whose usefulness determined the carrot. Received the child's education was practical and unadorned, learned by watching and by doing rather than by instruction in letters or in the arts of theft reborn. And the child learned to spin and to weave, to mend garments, to carry water without spilling, to tend a small hearth, to recognize the signs offeredness in the grapes and the olives, to know when the grain would be ready for harvest. And in the evenings, when the work slowed and the lamp burned low, the older workers would tell stories in low voices, not of heroes and off-distant wars, but of small human things, of births and of deaths, of the price of a goat in the market, of a freedman who had once been a slave and who now returned to the estate with a new tunic and a voice that had the ease of Simeon who had tasted a different life. And these stories were lessons in the shape of the world, teaching the child how to read the signs of fortune and misfortune, and how to hold one's heart steady in the face of both. Child's body changed slowly, the limbs lengthening, the hands growing calloused from small tasks, the face losing the roundness of infancy and taking on the sharper planes of youth. And with these changes came new responsibilities, the child being sent to the fields to learn the pruning off wines, to carry heavier baskets of grapes, to stand in the heat of the midday sun, and to move with the steady patience of those who harvest. And the overseer's voice would cut across the rows, sharp and precise, correcting emotion, demanding a quicker pace. And the child learned to answer with a bowed head and a steady hand. For resistance was costly and often futile in a world where the law and custom placed the body of the enslaved within the dominion of another. Child watched the freeborn children as they grew too, noting the differences that were not only in clothing or in food, but in the very way the world treated them. The way a freeborn child could run across the courtyard without fear of reprimand, the way their laughter could rise and fall without conceits, The way their parents spoke to them of futures that included study, travel, marriage arranged with advantage. And the child felt the small, persistent ache of exclusion, a knowledge that the world's possibilities were not equally distributed. And yet the child also learned the subtle ways in which the enslaved carved out small freedoms. A stolen moment by the river to wash one's face and to look at the sky. A whispered joke shared with a companion while the overseer's back was turned. A small act of kindness in the exchange of a piece of bread for a handful of figs. And these small freedoms were treasured like secret coins that could be spent in the currency of memory. Seasons continued their slow turning, each bringing its own labors and its own dangers. And the child learned to mark time by the work rather than by the calendar, by the first green of the vines in spring, by the heavy heat of summer when the air itself seemed to press upon the skin, by the harvest in autumn when the fields were full of movement and the nights were long with the sorting of grain, by the cold of winter when the fires burned low and feck-offs came more often. And through these cycles the child's understanding of life deepened, not in the abstract, but in the concrete. Knowledge of how to keep a body fed and a family clothed, and how to hold grief and joy in the same small chest without, letting either overwhelm the other. There were moments of tenderness that arrived like small, unexpected gifts. The mother pressing a piece of bread into the child's hand with a look that said more than words. The father returning with a small scrap of cloth that had been mended into a toy. The older sister braiding the child's hair in the evening light while humming a tune that had been taught by her own mother. And these moments were not grand, but they were real. And they formed a quiet architecture of care that supported the child through the long days. A network of small mercies that made endurance possible. And yet the child also learned the harsher truths. The way that bodies could be bought and sold. The way that a family might be broken by a single decision in the market town. The way that a child could be taken from a mother and sent to another estate. The way that a sickness could take a life with a speed that left no time for farewells. And these truths settled into the child's bones like a slow, steady ache. A knowledge that the world was not only shaped by labor and by love, but also by forces beyond the reach of any single person. And that survival often depended on a mixture of skill, of luck, and of small kindnesses of others as the child moved toward the end of childhood and the threshold of youth. The tasks grew heavier and the expectations clearer, the overseas voice more exacting, the days longer, and the child felt the slow hardening of the body and of the spirit. A resilience that was not chosen but required, and in the quiet hours, when the lamp burned low and the courtyard lay still, the child would sometimes lie awake and listen to the sounds of the estate, the distant lowing of animals, the soft murmur of voices, the creak of a cart on the road beyond, and in those hours the child's thoughts would drift like leaves on a slow river, touching on memories of the mother's hands, on the face of a sibling who had been taken by fever, on the taste of a fig eaten in secret, on the sight of the sea described by a woman who had once seen it. And these thoughts were neither complaints nor prayers, but the quiet accumulation of a life that was being lived in the small, steady increments of labor and of loveth. Child's world was not simple nor wholly bleak. It was a place of many textures, of small joys and of persistent hardships, of people who loved and who were loved in return, of bodies that bore the marks of work and off weather, of hands that mended and hands that punished, of dreams that were kept close and sometimes shared in whispers. And as the child grew, the shape of the future became clearer, not as a single path, but as a field of possibilities knit by the realities of ownership and of need. And the child learned to move within those limits with a careful grace, to find moments of beauty in the turning of the seasons, in the taste of a ripe grape, in the hush of the courtyard at dawn, and to hold the memory of those moments like a small, warm stone against the chest when the days grew long and the work heavy. In the end, the child's childhood was a long, slow lesson in the art of thriving within constraints, a learning of how to keep the body fed and the spirit intact, how to read the moods of the overseer and the needs of the household, how to find companionship in the shared labors of the quarters, how to hold grief and tenderness together without letting either consume the other. And as the child stood on the threshold of youth, the world seemed both vast and tightly bound, full of small wonders and of unyielding demands. And the child carried forward the knowledge of parents' hands, of siblings' laughter and loss, of the season's work, of the quiet economies of the storeroom, all braided together into the single, unadorned thread that would guide the next stage of life, a thread that was neither chosen nor rejected, but simply taken up and followed, step by careful step, into the long, uncertain days that lay ahead, the future unfolding slowly like the turning of a page in a book whose ending had not yet been written. And the child moved forward with the steady, unspoken resolve of one who has learned to endure, to remember, and to keep small dreams alive in the secret places of the heart, without fanfare, without proclamation, simply continuing into the next season of life as the estate itself continued its slow, unceasing work under the same sun and the same sky, the lives within it braided together by labor and by the quiet, persistent hope that tomorrow might hold a small mercy more than today had offered. As the boy crossed the threshold into youth, his body lengthened and his limbs grew lean with the steady shaping of labor, and the estate that had once seemed impossibly vast now unfolded before him with a familiarity that came from years of watching and listening and learning, the vineyards stretching across the slopes like ordered lines of green, the olive groves standing in their quiet clusters, the fields of grain shifting with the wind. And he moved through these spaces with a new sense of purpose, no longer the small child who carried twigs and swept corners, but a youth whose hands were expected to contribute in ways that mattered to the household's survival. And the overseer watched him with a sharper eye now, measuring his strength, his obedience, his endurance. For the years of childhood leniency had passed, and the demands of youth pressed upon him like the weight of the baskets. He now carried the mornings, began before the sun had fully risen, the sky still pally and cool, and he would rise from his mat with the others, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, tying his hair back with a strip of cloth, and stepping into the courtyard where the tools were kept, the overseer already present with a list of tasks and a voice that cut through the quiet like a blade, assigning each worker to their place, and the youth took his position among the rows of laborers, Hishans learning the pruning of vines with a precision that required both strength and delicacy, the careful cutting that shaped the harvest months ahead, and he felt the ache in his shoulders as he carried baskets heavy with grapes, the weight pressing into his bones, the sun warming his back as the day stretched long and unbroken. He watched the older workers with a mixture of respect and apprehension, noting the way their bodies moved with a practiced rhythm, their hands steadgiven when their faces showed the strain of years. And he understood that their knowledge was a kind of inheritance, passed down not through words, but through repetition of tasks, the subtle adjustments of posture, the quiet endurance that allowed them to continue even when the body protested. And he learned to imitate their movements, to pace himself so that he would not falter before Thede was done, to breathe in a way that kept the fatigue from overwhelming him too quickly. And in this way, he began to take his place among them, not as occult, but as a worker whose labor mattered. His mother continued her work at the loom, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm that had shaped his earliest memories. And he saw how the ears had settled into her shoulders, how her back bent slightly from the weight of the tasks she carried, how her fingers, though still nimble, bore the marks of countless hours spent weaving and mending. And he felt a quiet eschewing he watched her, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. For he knew that her life had been shaped by the same forces that now shaped his, and that her dreams, if she had ever spoken them aloud, had long since been folded into the daily work like threads woven into cloth, and he wished he could ease her burdens. Though he knew that such wishes had little place in the world, they inhibited his father, when present, moved through the estate with a steadiness that came from years of tending animals and fields. His hands large and sure as led the goats to pasture or milked the ewes. His voice low as he spoke to the beasts, and the youth watched him with a mixture of admiration and distance, seeing in his father's gait the marks of a life shaped by labor and by the quiet acceptance of limits. And he learned from him the practical knowledge that kept a household fed, the signs of a coming drought, the way to judge the health of an animal by the brightness of its eyes, the way to mend a fence so that it would withstand the winter winds. And these lessons settled into him like seeds planted in fertile soil, growing slowly into a deeper understanding the world. The youth's relationships with his siblings, when they existed, shifted as he grew older, the younger ones looking to him for guidance, the older honest treating him with a mixture of camaraderie and expectation. And he found himself taking on the role of protector and teacher, showing the younger children how to carry water without spilling, how to hold a basket so that it would not tip, how to move through the courtyard with a gait that would not attract the overseer's notice. And he felt a quiet pride in these moments, a sense of belonging that came from the shared labor and the shared hardships of the quarters. And he understood these bonds were both fragile and precious, for he had seen how easily families could be broken by sale or by sickness. And he held his siblings close in the evenings, speaking to them in low tones about small comforts and small hopes. The youth's education continued in the practical tasks that filled each day, learned by watching and by doing rather than by instruction in letters or in the arts of the freeborn. And he learned to spin and to weave, to mend garments with a precision that made the seams nearly invisible, to carry water without spilling, to tend a small hearth, to recognize the signs of ripeness in the grapes and the olives, to know when the grain would be ready for harvest. And in the evenings, when the work slowed and the lamp burned low, the older workers would tell stories in low voices, not of heroes and of distant wars but of small, human things, of births and of deaths, of the price of a goat in the market, of a freedman who had once been a slave and who now returned to the state with a new tunic and a voice that had the ease of someone who had tasted a different life. And these stories were lessons in the shape of the world, teaching the youth how to read the signs of fortune and misfortune, and how to hold one's heart steady in the face of both. He observed the lives of other slaves and of the free people who lived on the estate with a careful eye, noting the differences that were not only in clothing or in food, but in the very manner of being. The freeborn who moved with a lightness that came from not having to account for every breath, the matron who issued commands and who expected them to be obeyed without question, the steward who kept the accounts and who measured the household's needs against the market's demands. And the youth learned the social hierarchies that governed every interaction, the small gestures that marked rank, the way a freeborn child's glance could be returned with a smile, while an enslaved child's glance might be met with a cold, indifferent stare, and he learned to navigate these boundaries with a careful humility that was not only servile but a learned form of respect for the order that held the estate. Together disease and death remained constant, companions in the quarters, and they saw how fevers could take a child in a matter of days, how infection could set into a wound that had been poorly tended, how childbirth could be perilous for those who labored through pregnancy with little rest, and the numbers of those who did not survive were not spoken of in statistics, but in empty places at the hearth, and in the quiet that followed a burial. And Helen the names of those who had been lost. The small details of their Littlestock remained in memory. A favorite song hummed at the loom, a laugh that hadn't brightened a morning, a hand that had mended a torn sleeve, and who understood that death was not a single event, but a slow, recurring presence of it, shaped the way people lived and loved. Punishment continued to shape the rhythm of life. The overseer's sharp words, the withholding of a portion of bread, the assignment of extra work for a week, the public correction that reminded everyone of their place. And Beowulf learned to measure his steps by the overseer's temper, to keep his head bowed when the man passed, to answer only when spoken to. And yet there were also moments when the overseer's attention was diverted, and the workers found small spaces of relief. A shared joke, a stolen fig, a moment by the river where the water washed the dust from their hands, and for a breath they felt something like ease. He watched the free-born children as they were taught letters and numbers and the arts of running a household, their futures spoken of in terms of marriage and alliances and the management of land. And he saw how different the world could be for those born to privilege, their choices wide and their mistakes often forgiven. And this observation sharpened his sense of the limits that bound him. Yet it also taught him to value the small freedoms he could claim, the quiet companionship of a friend who would share a crust of bread, the secret pleasure of a ripe grape eaten in the shade, the small pride in a garment mended so well that no seam showed. And these small things became the currency of his inner life as he moved through adolescence. His body hardened and his endurance increased, the sun and the wind and the work shaping him into someone who could carry heavier loads and who could stand longer in the heat. And with this physical change came a widening of his responsibilities, the overseer assigning him to tasks that required steadiness and trust, the carrying of messages to the steward, the tending of a small flock of geese, the supervision of younger children when the mothers were needed elsewhere. And these duties brought with them a quiet authority that was not freedom, but a recognition of skill. And Beowulf felt a complicated pride in being relied upon, even as he understood the trillions did not alter the fundamental fact of his bondage. He learned the economy of the estate in detail, the way grain was measured and stored, the way oil was pressed from olives and stored in amphorae, the way wine was tasted and judged for quality before being set aside for the household or for sale. And he saw how the steward's calculations could change the lives of many, how a poor harvest could mean harder days and thinner portions, how a good season might bring a small easing of burdens. And he understood that his life was bound to forces larger than any single person, to weather and to market, and to the decisions of those who owned the land in the evenings, when the work slowed and the lamp burned low, the quarters filled with the soft murmur of voices, stories told in low tones about places beyond the estate, about markets and ships and towns where strangers came and went, about freedmen who had once been slaves and who returned with new clothes and new speech. And the youth listened to these tales with a hunger that was not only for news, but for the sense of a world that extended beyond the fields. And he held these stories like small maps in his mind, tracing routes he might never walk, but that gave shape to his imagination and to depravate dreams he kept like a secret under his breast. Those dreams were cautious and often unspoken, a wish for a day when his children might know less hunger, a hope that a sibling might be spared the fever that had taken others, a longing to see the sea described by a woman who had once traveled. And though he knew the law and custom that bound him, he also felt the stubborn ember of possibility that sometimes glowed in the quarters, a rumor of a freedman who had bought his freedom, a tale of a master who had shown mercy, a whisper of a market where a child had been spared from sale. And these small sparks were enough to keep the heart moving through the long days, as youth gave way to the responsibilities of early manhood. The young man stood at the edge of a life that was both familiar and uncharted. His skills recognized, his body strong, his mind shaped by the steady accumulation of knowledge and of loss. And he moved forward with a careful step, carrying the memory of his parents' hands, the names of siblings who had been taken or who had died, the lessons of the older workers, the quiet economies of the storeroom, and the small, private dreams that he kept like a talisman against the weight of the world. His days were long and measured by the sun, the morning beginning before dawn, with the clatter of jars and the low murmur of those who would not beetle. And he rose with the others, his limbs carrying the memory of countless small tasks, his hands calloused and sure, and he moved through the courtyard to the fields where the vines and the olives demanded attention, the overseer's voice cutting across the rows with precise commands, correcting a motion, demanding a quicker pace. And the man learned to answer with a bowed head and a steady hand, for resistance was costly and often futile in a world where the law and custom placed the body of the enslaved within the dominion of another. His work varied with the seasons. In spring, he helped prepare the soil and plant seedlings. In summer, he tended the vines and the olives, pruning and thinning so that the harvest might be abundant. In autumn, he carried basket sheavy with fruit to the presses and to the storehouses. And in winter, he mended tools, repaired fences, and tended the animals. And through each season his body adapted, muscles forming along the shoulders and back, calluses thickening in the palms, a quiet endurance settling into the bones like a second nature. He observed the household above with a steady, careful eye, noting the way the matron moved through rooms with a certainty that came from authority, the way the steward kept accounts with a meticulous hand, the way the free-born children were taught letters and numbers and the arts of running a household. And he saw how the world of privilege was maintained by the labor of many, how the steward's calculations could change the lives of those below, how a decision to sell a parcel of land or to send produce to market could mean a season of ease or a season of hunger for the workers. And he understood that this life was bound to these larger currents, to weather and to market, and to the choices of those who owned the land. He also watched the lives of other slaves with a careful compassion, noting how some grew old within the estate, their bodies bent, but their knowledge deep, how others were sold and taken away, their names spoken in loud voices, and then remembered in the quiet of the quarters. How many died from disease or from the slow wearing of the body under constant labor. And Helen to measure the fragility of life by the empty places at the hearth, and be the graves at the edge of the field's illness remained a steady threat. Fevers and coughs moving through the quarters with the change of seasons. Infections setting into wounds that had been poorly tended. Childbirth carrying risks for those who labored through pregnancy with little rest. And the man saw how the community responded with practicalities, boiled herbs and warm cloths, poultices and splints, and with prayers whispered to gods whose names were spoken softly, for loud prayers might draw the overseer's attention. And sometimes the remedies worked and the sick recovered, and sometimes they did not, and the man learned to hold grief and care together, to tend the living while remembering the dead, to carry the memory of those lost like a small stone in the pocket. Heavy but familiar punishment continued to shape the rhythm of life. The overseer's sharp words, the withholding of a portion of bread, the assignment of extra work, the public correction that reminded everyone of their place. And the man learned to measure his steps by the overseer's temper, to keep his head bowed when the man passed, to answer only when spoken to. And yet there were also moments of quiet resistance, not in open rebellion, but in small acts that preserved dignity, the careful mending of a garment so that it would not show the household's neglect, the sharing of a portion of food with a neighbor who had been ill, the teaching off a younger worker a skill that might make their labor easier. And these acts were the threads that held the community together, a network of small mercies that made endurance possible. He formed relationships within the quarters that were both practical and deep, friendships born of shared labor and of shared loss, companions who would stand by one another in the fields, and who would sit together in the evening stow, share a small meal and a story, lovers whose attachments were careful and guarded because of the ever-present risk of sale, and families that were held together by the daily work and by the small rituals of care, the washing of Achel's hair in the river, the mending of a father's tunic, the sharing of a piece of fruit at dusk. And these relationships were the true wealth of the quarters, more lasting than any coin and more necessary than any promise. As he aged, his body bore the marks of years of labor, the shoulders broad and scarred, the hands thick with callus, the back carrying the slow ache of seasons of heavy lifting. And he found himself given tasks that required steadiness and knowledge rather than raw strength, tending the presses, supervising the younger workers, mending tools with a practiced hand, and in these roles he found a quiet authority, a recognition of skill that did not alter his status, but that gave him a place within the estate's order. He watched younger men arrive with faces unlined and with quick steps, and remembered himself at that age. The hunger for small freedoms, the secret dreams, the private maps of places he might never see, and he felt a tenderness for them that was both protective and resigned. Knowing how the years would shape them as they had shaped him, the seasons continued to mark the passage of time, each year adding another layer to the slow accumulation of memory, and he kept careful watch over the cycles of planting and harvest, of pruning and pressing, of storage and sale, understanding how each action fit into the larger economy of the estate, and he saw how the steward's decisions and the matron's needs could change the lives of many, how a poor harvest could mean harder days and thinner portions, how a good season might bring a small easing of burdens, and Helen to accept these fluctuations with a steady heart, to prepare for scarcity and to savor small mercies when they came in. The quiet hours he reflected on the arc of his life with a calm that was not peace, but a steady acceptance. He thought of the mother who had teed him to her back and taught him the rhythm of the loom, of the father who hadled the animals to pasture and taught him the arithmetic of survival, of siblings who had been taken or who had died, of friends who had shared bread and stories, of the small acts of kindness that had kept him going. And he held these memories like a woven cloth, each thread a life, each stitch a moment off care. And he understood that his life had been shaped by labor and by love in equal measure, by the demands of the estate and by the quiet mercies of Fasu who lived within it. And as the years of early adulthood unfolded, he moved through them with the steady, unspoken. As the years of early adulthood settled into the deeper weight of maturity, the man found that time no longer moved with the restless urgency that had once filled his limbs in youth, but instead unfolded in long, steady stretches shaped by the seasons and by the familiar rhythm of labor. And he began to feel the first quiet signs of age in his body, not as sudden pains, but as a slow heaviness in the legs when he rose before dawn, a stiffness in the back after carrying baskets through the fields, a faint ache in the hands that had spent so many years gripping tools and tying knots and lifting burdens. And though he continued to work with the same steady diligence that had marked his youth, he sensed that the years were beginning to gather around him. Like a soft but persistent weight, he moved through the estate with a familiarity that came from decades of repetition, the vineyards stretching across the slopes in their ordered rows, the olive trees standing in their quiet clusters, the fields of grain shifting with the wind. And he felt the land as something both intimate and distant, a place he had known since birth yet never possessed, a place that shaped him even as it remained beyond his reach. And he walked the paths between the vines with a slower step now, pausing sometimes to rest his hand on a wooden stake or to stretch, his back as he looked out across the fields where younger workers moved with the quick, eager motions he remembered from his own youth. The overseer, who had once watched him with the sharp eye reserved for the strong and the capable, now regarded him with a different measure, seeing in him not only a worker, but a man whose years had given him a steadiness that could be relied upon. And the overseer assigned him tasks that required knowledge rather than speed: the tending of tools, the supervision of younger workers, the careful sorting of olives and grapes, the mending of fences, and the repair of baskets. And the man accepted these tasks with a quiet gratitude, for he knew that his body no longer moved with the same ease it once had, and he was relieved to be spared the heaviest burdens, even as he felt a faint ache of pride at the recognition of his experience, watched the younger workers with a mixture of tenderness and resignation, seeing in their faces the same hunger for small freedoms that had once lived in his own chest, the same quiet dreams that flickered like small flames in the dimness of the quarters. And he felt a protective instinct toward them, offering guidance when he could, teaching them how to pace themselves in the heat, how to lift a basket without straining the back, how to mend a tool so that it would last another season. And he saw in their eyes a respect that warmed him, a recognition that he had walked the path they were now beginning to tread. His relationships within the quarters deepened as he aged, the bonds formed through shared labor and shared loss becoming more precious with each passing year. And he found comfort in the familiar faces that had accompanied him through so many seasons. The old woman who still hummed the same tune she had sung when he was a child, the man who had once been a potter and who now spent his days repairing broken tools with a patience that seemed to come from another world, the younger mothers who tended their children with the same careful tenderness his own mother had shown him. And he felt a quiet sense of belonging in their presence, a recognition that their lives were woven together like the threads of a cloth, each one supporting the others in ways that were both visible and unseen. Illness continued to move through the quarters with the change of seasons, and the man saw how the fevers that had once seemed distant now lingered longer in his own body, how a simple cough could settle into his chest and remain for weeks, how a small cut could take longer to heal. And he accepted these changes with a calm that came from years of witnessing the fragility of life, for he had seen many fall to sickness, children and elders, and those in the prime of life, and he understood that the body was a vessel that wore down slowly, its strength diminishing like the fading light at dusk. And he learned to move with greater care, to rest when he could, to conserve his energy for the tasks that mattered most. The seasons continued their slow turning, each one bringing its own labors and its own quiet beauty. And the man found himself noticing details he had overlooked in his youth, the way the light shifted across the courtyard in the late afternoon, the sound of the wind moving through the olive trees, the scent of the earth after a rain. And these small observations became a source of comfort to him, a reminder that even in a life shaped by labor, there were moments of stillness and of quiet wonder. And he held these moments close, letting them settle into his memory like smooth stones gathered along a riverbank. He thought often of his parents as he aged, remembering the way his mother's hands had moved at the loom, the way his father had spoken to the animals with a gentleness that belied the hardness of his life. And he felt their presence in the rhythms of his days, in the tasks he performed, and the lessons he passed on to the younger workers. And he understood that their lives had shaped his in ways that extended far beyond the years he had spent with them, their memories woven into the fabric of his being like threads that could not be separated from the whole. He also thought of the siblings he had lost, those taken by fever or by sail, their faces blurred by time, yet still present in the quiet corners of his mind. And he felt a soft ache when he remembered them, a longing that had never fully faded. And he wondered sometimes what their lives might have been had they remained on the estate, whether they would have walked the same paths he had walked, whether they would have found the same small joys and endured the same hardships. And these thoughts drifted through him like the slow movement of clouds across the sky, neither painful nor comforting, simply present. As the man entered the later years of adulthood, his body grew slower, the mornings more difficult, the evenings more welcome, and he found himself spending more time in the quieter tasks of the estate, sorting grain, repairing tools, tending the small fires that warmed the quarters in winter. And he felt a sense of peace in these tasks, a recognition that he had earned the right to move more slowly, to rest when needed, to let the younger workers carry the heavier burdens. And he accepted this shift with a humility that came from understanding the natural progression of life, watched the freeborn members of the household age as well, the matron's hair turning gray, the steward's steps growing slower, the children who had once played in the courtyard, now grown and taking on responsibilities of their own. And he saw how time touched all lives, regardless of status, though in different ways. And he felt a quiet sense of connection to the passage of years, a recognition that life moved forward for everyone. Even if the paths they walked were shaped by different forces, a man's friendships deepened in these years, the bonds formed through decades of shared labor becoming a source of strength and comfort. And he spent many evenings sitting with the older workers, sharing stories of the past, recalling the faces of those who had come and gone, speaking of the seasons and the harvests and the small events that had shaped their lives. And these conversations were like a gentle weaving of memory, each voice adding a thread to the tapestry of their shared experience. And the man felt a warmth in these moments, a sense of belonging that eased the weight of the years as he moved into old age. The man found that his body no longer responded with the same reliability it once had, the stiffness in his joints becoming more pronounced, the ache in his back lingering longer, the strength in his hands diminishing. And he accepted these changes with a calm that came from understanding the natural course of life. For he had seen many grow old before him, their bodies bending under the weight of years, their steps slowing, their voices softening. And he knew that he was now walking the same path they had walked, spent more time sitting in the shade of the olive trees or near the doorway of the quarters, watching the younger workers move through the fields with the same energy he had once possessed. And he felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia as he observed them, remembering the days when his own body had moved with such ease. And he offered guidance when asked, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over a lifetime, teaching them how to read the signs of the weather, how to judge the health of a vine, how to mend a tool so that it would last another season. And he felt a quiet satisfaction in passing on these lessons, knowing that his experience would continue to shape the work of the estate even after he was gone. The man's world grew smaller as he aged, the distances he once walked now seeming longer, the tasks he once performed now requiring more effort. And he found himself spending more time in reflection, his thoughts drifting through the memories of his life like a slow-moving river, touching on moments of joy and of sorrow, of labor and of rest, of companionship and of loss. And he felt a sense of calm in these reflections, a recognition that his life had been shaped by forces both within and beyond his control, and that he had moved through the years with as much dignity and steadiness as the world had allowed. He thought often of the small joys that had sustained him through the years, the taste of a ripe grape eaten in the shade, the sound of laughter in the quarters, the warmth of a shared meal, the quiet companionship of a friend, the sight of the fields at dawn when the light was soft and the air cool. And he held these memories close, letting them warm him in the colder months when the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls and the fires burned low. He also thought of the losses he had endured, the faces of those who had been taken by sickness or by sale, the empty places at the hearth, the graves at the edge of the fields. And he felt a soft ache when he remembered them, a longing that had never fully faded. Yet he did not dwell on these memories with bitterness, for he understood that loss was a part of life, woven into the fabric of existence, like the darker threads in a cloth, and he accepted this with a calm that came from years of witnessing the fragility of life. As the man entered the final years of his life, he found that his days were shaped more by rest than by labor, his body no longer able to perform the tasks that had once defined his existence. And he spent much of his time sitting in the courtyard or near the fields, watching the world move around him, the younger workers tending the vines and the olives, the children playing in the dust, the animals moving through their routines. And he felt a sense of peace in these moments, a recognition that life continued even as his own strength faded. He was cared for by those who had known him for many years. The younger workers bringing him water and food, the older women tending to his needs with the same gentle hands that had once soothed him as a child. And he felt a deep gratitude for their kindness, a recognition that the bonds formed through decades of shared labor were stronger than any hardship. And he accepted their care with a humility that came from understanding the interconnectedness of their lives. The man's thoughts drifted more often to the past in these years, his memories becoming a source of comfort and of quiet reflection. And he found himself recalling the faces of those who had shaped his life, the mother who had tied him to her back and taught him the rhythm of the loom, the father who had led the animals to pasture and taught him the arithmetic of survival, the siblings who had been taken or who had died, the friends who had shared bread and stories. And he felt their presence in the quiet moments of the day, as though they lingered in the air around him, woven into the fabric of his memory like threads that could not be separated from the whole. He also thought of the land that had shaped his life, the vineyards and the olive groves and the fields of grain, the paths he had walked so many times, the tools he had held in his hands, the seasons that had marked the passage of time. And he felt a deep connection to the estate, not as something he owned, but as something that had formed the backdrop of his existence, a place that had shaped him even as he had shaped it through his labor. And he accepted this connection with a calm that came from understanding the nature of his life. As his strength continued to fade, the man found that his world grew quieter, the sounds of the estate becoming softer, the movements of the workers becoming more distant. And he spent long hours sitting in the shade or lying on his mat, his thoughts drifting like leaves on a slow-moving river, touching on memories and on moments of stillness. And he felt a sense of peace in these moments, a recognition that his life had been lived with as much dignity and steadiness as the world had allowed. He no longer thought of freedom in the way he had once imagined it, for the idea had become too distant, too abstract. And instead, he thought of the simple act of continuing, of waking each morning and moving through the day with whatever strength remained, of finding small spaces where his thoughts could drift without fear, of holding on to the memories that had shaped him, even the painful ones, for they were the threads that formed the fabric of his life in the final seasons of his life. He moved with a quietness that matched the slow turning of the world, his hands folded in his lap as he watched the younger workers move through the fields with the same steady rhythm he had once known. And he felt a tenderness for them that was both protective and resigned, knowing that they too would one day walk the path he now walked, their bodies bending under the weight of years, their steps slowing, their voices softening. And he accepted this with a calm that came from understanding the natural progression of life. He thought often of the small joys that had sustained him through the years, the taste of a ripe grape eaten in the shade, the sound of laughter in the quarters, the warmth of a shared meal, the quiet companionship of a friend, the sight of the fields at dawn when the light was soft and the air cool. And he held these memories close, letting them warm him in the colder months when the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls and the fires burned low. He also thought of the losses he had endured, the faces of those who had been taken by sickness or by sale, the empty places at the hearth, the graves at the edge of the fields. And he felt a soft ache when he remembered them, a longing that had never fully faded. Yet he did not dwell on these memories with bitterness, for he understood that loss was a part of life, woven into the fabric of existence, like the darker threads in a cloth, and he accepted this with a calm that came from years of witnessing the fragility of life. As the man's strength continued to fade, he found that his days were shaped more by rest than by labor, his body no longer able to perform the tasks that had once defined his existence. And he spent much of his time sitting in the courtyard or near the fields, watching the world move around him, the younger workers tending the vines and the olives, the children playing in the dust, the animals moving through their routines. And he felt a sense of peace in these moments, a recognition that, in the quiet that followed the final turning of his days, the estate settled once more into its slow and patient rhythm, the fields stretching outward beneath the same sky that had watched over his earliest steps and his last breaths, the vines lifting their leaves toward the sun as though nothing had changed, the olive trees standing in their familiar rows with the same calm endurance they had shown through every season of his life. And the workers moved through the fields with steady hands, their footsteps soft against the earth, their voices low as they carried out the tasks that had shaped generations before them. The place where he had lived all his years held a gentle stillness in the days that followed, not a silence of sorrow, but a quiet that settled like dust in the corners of the quarters, a hush that lingered in the spaces where he had once sat, the worn mat bearing the faint memory of his weight, the tools he had mended resting in their places, with the marks of his hands still faintly visible. And those who had known him felt his absence not as a sharp wound, but as a soft hollowing, a space that folded itself into their routines with the same subtlety as the shifting of light at dusk. The younger workers spoke of him as they moved through the fields, recalling the way he had shown them how to lift a basket without straining the back, how to read the weather in the scent of the wind, how to mend a broken handle so that it would last another season. And their words drifted through the air like threads of memory woven into the fabric of the estate, each one carrying a small piece of the life he had lived, each one settling gently into the soil beneath their feet. And though the days continued as they always had, there was a faint warmth in the way they spoke his name, a quiet acknowledgment of the years he had given to the land. The older workers remembered him in the evenings when the lamps were lit and the day's labor had ended, their voices soft as they spoke of the seasons they had shared, the harvests they had endured, the small moments of rest beneath the shade of the olive trees. And their memories rose and fell like the slow breathing of the earth, unhurried and without urgency, a steady rhythm that matched the turning of the world around them. And in their recollections, he lived on in the gentle cadence of their stories, not as a figure of greatness, but as a steady presence woven into the long tapestry of their days. The land itself seemed to hold a trace of him, the paths he had walked worn smooth by years of footsteps, the vines he had tended lifting their leaves toward the sun as though carrying forward the quiet care he had given them, the fields ripening in their time with the same patient certainty that had shaped every season of his life, and the estate breathed on beneath the wide sky, the days unfolding one into the next, the seasons turning with their ancient rhythm, the world continuing in its slow, unbroken flow. And as the story of his years softened into the stillness of the evening, the light grew dim and the sounds of the world fell into a gentle hush. And those who listen from far beyond the estate may feel the weight of time loosen its hold, the breath growing slower, the thoughts drifting like dust in a quiet room, and the long path of his life settling into a calm that asks for nothing and promises nothing, only a moment of rest to those who have followed his journey through the turning of seasons and the passing of years. The quiet that remains may feel like a soft blanket drawn across the mind, a gentle reminder that even the heaviest stories can end in silence rather than in sorrow, and that the world often continues in its steady way, long after a single life has come to rest. The fields ripening, the wind moving through the trees, the night rising with its cool and patient breath, and the memory of a life lived in labor and endurance drifting into the air like a faint echo carried on the wind, and as the final traces of his footsteps fade into the earth, the listeners who remain may allow their own thoughts to drift, like slow-moving clouds across a pale sky, unhurried and without direction, letting the weight of the day slip away as the darkness deepens, the body softening into stillness, the mind loosening its grip on the hours that have passed, and the quiet settling around them like a gentle tide that rises without haste, for in the hush that follows such a story, there is room for rest, room for breath, room for the gentle settling of the heart. And the world beyond the window grows dim and distant, the sounds fading into a soft murmur, the night drawing close with its cool and steady presence, and the listeners may feel themselves carried by the same slow rhythm that shaped his life, a rhythm that asks for nothing more than a moment of stillness, and so the tale drifts into silence, not ending, but simply dissolving into the hush of the evening, leaving only a faint warmth in the air, a lingering echo of a life lived in the turning of seasons. And the listeners may let their eyes grow heavy, their breath slow and deep, as the last threads of the story unwind and slip into the quiet that waits beyond words, a quiet that holds them gently as the night settles around them once more, the world softening into shadow, the thoughts drifting like leaves on a calm river, the story fading into the darkness with the same quiet grace that shaped every moment of his life. Let the hush of the old fields linger around you as the last traces of the story fade and the night rises with its cool and patient breath.